Lisa Middleton,
Present.
David Miller,
Here.
Stacy Oliveris, Lorena Ortega,
Here.
Jason Perez, Ramon Rubacava,
Here.
Teresa Taylor,
Here.
Shonda Wesley,
Excused.
Betty Yee.
Here.
Mr. President, Stacy Oliveris
Here.
and Jason Perez. I do not show Jason as of yet, Mr. President.
Okay. Well, we'll go through these first two items and see if he could join us by then. The next item on the agenda is approval of the October 16 Board of Administration time agenda. Do I have a motion?
Move approval.
Moved by Ms. Taylor, second by Mr. Miller. Mrs.
Second.
Hopper, please.
Margaret Brown,
Aye.
Fechner,
Yes.
Frank Ruffino for Fiona Maw,
Yes.
Lisa Middleton,
Aye.
David Miller,
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris,
Aye.
Lorena Ortega,
Aye.
Jason Perez, Ramon Rubacava,
Aye.
Teresa Taylor,
Aye.
Shonda Wesley,
Excused.
Betty Yee.
Aye.
Mr. President, I have Teresa Taylor making the motion and David Miller seconding it. And I have all ayes, with the exception of Jason Perez.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hopper. The next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance, and I've asked Ms. Taylor to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Great. Hand over heart. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, under God. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting this.
One nation.
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. These trying times. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the Chief Executive Officer's report. Ms. Frost.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I just have a very brief report for this additional meeting. I'll do a full report at our November board meeting, but just wanted to say thank you to our employer partners for attending the 2020 educational forum that we held over the last 2 days. We had just over 1,600 people in attendance. We also had about 16 of the 21 board members or their delegates who were also in attendance, so really appreciate that as well. We'll be promoting our Spotlight on Excellence winner, Trieste Huey, through social media. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the video associated with her award, highly encourage you to do so. If it's not out on our website, it will be very soon. And then I wanted, again, just to thank everyone who attended, as well as our own team who was able to deliver some really important content and information that the public employers are really needing right now. And all of this through this new virtual format. So we had a few little technical hiccups here and there, but overall, I think the event was really well done. People were patient and I think really received a high quality program. So we are certainly hoping to return to more larger in-person events later this year, but we do believe that these virtual meetings will be with us far into the future and likely will become a part of our permanent ongoing offerings, both to our members and to our employers. We've gotten pretty significant feedback from our membership that they really do like us coming to them in their homes in some of these virtual one-on-one appointments, or the 98% satisfaction rating in the last virtual CB. So we do believe that these will be with us for a while, but certainly are looking forward to more of that in-person and networking opportunities as well. So again, I'll have a regular update for you in our November meeting, and I'll conclude my remarks at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Frost. Okay, seeing no questions for Ms. Frost, I note that Ms. Hopper note that Mr. Perez has joined the meeting. And so we now will go to the next item on the agenda, which is an action agenda item. incentive compensation recommendations for Chief Investment Officer position. Ms. Tucker, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Board. This is Michelle Tucker, CalPERS team member. Today we have the Board's compensation consultant, Eric Gonzaga of Grant Thornton, here to present this item, and I'll turn it over to him in just a moment. As a reminder, compensation for the CIO position was revised in June 2018 when the position was vacant. The Board reviewed market data and consultant recommendations based on our comparator group and adopted revised base pay and incentive ranges to ensure we could attract highly qualified individuals. At that time, the Board had not yet finalized the pay philosophy and compensation structure for all executive and investment management positions. There was not yet a long-term incentive component included. In February of 2019, the Board adopted revised base pay and incentive ranges effective fiscal year 2019-20 for all investment management positions, as well as approved the inclusion of a long-term incentive component for those positions within the investment office. In September of 2019, the Board approved details and implementation for the long-term incentive plan effective beginning fiscal year 2019 to 2020. The CIO position was excluded from the long-term incentive as compensation had been recently revised when the position had been vacant. In November of 2019, the Board approved Grant Thornton's recommendation to add the long-term incentive to the compensation package for the Chief Executive Officer position. Please note that in our agenda item, we had two mentions of this that says the decision was made in November 2019, and one incorrectly had a typographical error and noted it as June 2020, but the actual decision was made in November of 2019, just so you can know for your records. With the CIO position currently being vacant and in recruitment, it's an opportune time for the Board to consider inclusion of the long-term incentive plan in the compensation package for this position. Unless you have any questions for me, I can turn it over to Mr. Gonzaga to present his search firm's recommendations.
Thank you, Ms. Tucker. I see no questions from board members, so you can proceed.
Great.
And before he proceeds, I just wanted to thank you, Eric, and thank you and Grant Thornton for your partnership over the years. And with that, I can turn it back to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to work with such an outstanding organization. But our recommendations are pretty straightforward. You think about what we're trying to do is align the CIO position consistent with that for other investment office professionals. And the rationale is certainly consistent, which is to blend, focus in terms of both annual overall performance in addition to long-term incentive performance. So there's a blend in making sure that decisions that are made now are rewarded for based on performance over the long term. So with that, our recommendations are straightforward. Maintain the existing salary range. Secondarily, reduce the targets and the maximum incentives for the annual incentives, and adopt a long-term incentive plan opportunity and structure consistent with that provided for the rest of the investment office. The result will simply be that at target, you'll position yourself within 2% of your current philosophy, which is to pay median total cash compensation for an approved peer group of organizations. And if performance is met at outstanding levels, obviously that would require exceeding peers significantly in terms of relative performance. Pay would be modestly above the 75th percentile. So those are the recommendations in and of itself. The rationale is just simply, one, it's good practice in terms of combination of annual and long-term incentives, that it aligns well with pension holders, and secondarily, it meets your total compensation philosophy, stated total compensation philosophy. And finally, it ensures alignment amongst all of the various executives and professionals in the investment office. So with that, nice and simple. So.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Mr. Fechner.
Thank you, Mr. President. This isn't about the presentation. I wanted to, along with Michelle, thank Eric and his partner Eric and Grant Thornton in general for all of the help over the last few years, and we really appreciate it. I just wanted to publicly thank you. So thanks, Eric.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Oliveris.
Thank you. Eric, I'd like to get a better understanding of the recommendation that Grant Thornton is making. So it seems like it would be a doubling of the CIO compensation if we're looking at the max potential, right? And we're looking at a bonus range or an annual incentive range of 0 to 120%, and then the LTI range of 80% to 120%.
That's right.
So it's almost like two bonuses, right? So one is something that they would receive on an annualized basis with a look back period, and then the other one's that long-term incentive. So that would help retention. Can you walk us through the LTI a little bit more in terms of how that's structured? And then secondarily, I'd like to understand what some of our peers are doing in this space.
Sure. Yeah, and so how it works is so the foundation of the annual incentive award, I mean, we have to there, is based on overall organizational performance, and certainly fund performance is a part of that. And to the extent that you achieve a certain award based on annual incentive performance, what would occur is that outside of paying out the annual incentive award, the equivalent of what was earned under the annual incentive plan would be deferred into an account, and it would go up or down based on total fund performance, and measured over a period of years. And so that award could go up or down, and it's based on absolute fund performance. And the purpose for that is through the annual incentive, you get relative performance, and that will fund the long-term incentive plan allocation, and subsequent, no different than the pension holders, those amounts will go up or down, just like the funding does, it will go up or down based on the return for the fund from an absolute basis. Does that make sense?
I'd like to better understand the mechanics of it. So I think that was a helpful narrative, but in terms of the actual mechanics, because this does get a little bit complicated and it is a different structure. So, and the annual incentive is based on relative performance.
Right.
So let's break that down a little bit more. So if our goal is to meet a particular benchmark,
right,
and that benchmark is met or is not met, can you kind of go through that tier, please?
Yeah, so I'll put it this way. To the extent that you exceed relative performance under the annual incentive plan, let's say that a $100,000 award is earned, okay? And that will be paid out as part of the annual incentive plan. Now, an additional $100,000 will be set aside, and those dollar amounts will go up or down based on absolute performance, subject to a cap of 150% of that allocation. So if $100,000 is allocated specifically to that long-term incentive award, if you go up by, say, 7% over the remaining performance period as part of that long-term incentive plan, the award will pay out at 107%. 107,000. If it goes down by 7%, you will receive an award of 93,000, at the end of it.
Okay, so it's almost like a one-to-one match. So if we're thinking about, let's talk about deferred comp, right? So that's probably a way of looking at this. So I have a 401k and I'm setting aside a certain percent. My employer matches 1-to-1. So I earn a bonus, I get that $100,000, and then 1-to-1 match, $100,000 goes into this LTI, and the value of that goes up and down with the total fund performance, correct?
That's right.
Got it. Okay, so let's go back to the annual incentive. I want to understand the actual structure of that in terms of the tiers. So if I meet the benchmark, do I get 0?
I think
if I might get meet versus below,
right.
How does that work? And versus, I've exceeded the benchmark by 5%, by 10%, et cetera.
Right. So and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but if you beat the benchmark, you will receive a target award. There is a modest amount, I think it goes down by maybe 0.5 points. If you miss relative performance by, say, a modest amount, you'll receive 50% of that target award. If you exceed by, I think it may be, maybe it's at 8.5 or 9%, somewhere around there. If you get to 8.5 to 9%, you'll pay out at a maximum award from an annual incentive plan standpoint. And
So
so,
meeting the benchmark by 800 to 900 bips? Is that what we're talking about?
no, it would be 140 bips. If
Oh,
yeah.
good. I would think that would be tremendous.
Yeah, exactly.
I would love to see that breakdown, because as we look at this compensation structure or this incentive structure, I want to make sure all of our incentives are correctly aligned so that we are really inducing excellent performance in terms of our investments, so that we're not just providing an annual incentive for somebody who just meets performance goals and doesn't exceed them.
Right.
But and that's where I think it'd help to have more clarity. Is there a document that could be shared with us?
Yeah, there is the plan documentation, and it would go back, the period over a couple of years. We've worked with your RIA in terms of coming up with the performance standards, along with obviously, different folks from your organization, just understanding historical performance. But there should be adequate documentation, sitting out there. There's a formal plan document that describes the rationale. For the existing annual incentive and long-term incentive plan component, and it's in one document.
Yeah, that would be helpful to get as we go through this, because I don't have, I think, the context I need to fully understand this. And then the second question I have, sorry, on the LTI range. So say that match has been set aside, that $100,000, for example, the value goes up and down with the total funds. Where does that money go? So 2021, probably we won't see the best market returns, I'm expecting. So then that $100,000 would decrease accordingly. But how are we doing that? I guess I'm not sure how that money is actually invested or what type of account it's held in, so that's adjusted. That part's not clear to me at all.
Yeah, it's set up as a separate account. They're based on the accounting systems, and HR keeps a track record of what the award balance was at the beginning, and tracks it on an annual basis as to whether or not it goes up or down. So.
And then so if it does go down, for example, that money goes where?
It won't pay out until.
It just won't pay out.
Yeah, it won't pay out
Okay,
until the end of the investment period. Yep, that's right.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Oliveris, this is Doug Hoffner. Maybe I can answer the first question. We've happy to share the document. There's the incentive comp and executive management policy in your resource center of your diligent board books. It's about a 25-page policy, which includes sample incentive calculations. I think to your previous point, we'd be happy to share that with the entire board as well. It's in there as part of the policies and documents related to the board's program.
The policies?
The resource guide, resource center of the diligent board books.
Yes,
titled,
and policies.
Yes, compensation policy for executive investment management positions.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Hoffner, yes, go ahead and just shoot a note to the board members to access that information. That'd be good. Mrs. Brown.
Thank you, Ms. Brown.
Mrs. Brown.
Mrs. Brown is my mother. Thank you. I want to thank Stacy for her comments. I too have questions about the incentives and Grant. Let me ask this. I'm sorry. Let me ask this question about incentive awards for when the investment staff does not beat the benchmark, because I think this is what Stacy was talking about. Because my understanding is even if they fall short of the benchmark, they still get an incentive. Is that correct?
A very, very modest amount. And that was put in for risk management purposes, just to make sure that there's no incentivization on a short-term basis to absolutely achieve the benchmark. It's a common policy out there to promote sound investment. That's correct.
So so they don't cheat and take on more risk in making the fund riskier to just so they could get their incentive award. Is that correct?
That's right, Ms. Brown.
Maybe I can help clarify Ms. Brown's question. So the annual incentive is related to benchmarks, which were identified, and the long-term incentive, the LTI, is related to absolute return. So if you do not get the absolute returns as identified, there is no payout. So really the goal of that is then over the long term, not only retention, but the improved funded status, et cetera, of the fund. So they're two different things measured by two different methodologies.
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Hopner. So when we say absolute return, are we measuring it against the 7% target? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. And then the annual incentive award is measured against the benchmark. But I have concerns because we change that benchmark. The staff makes a recommendation, we change the benchmark, and now we're able to basically stagger over the hurdle, stagger over the bar, and everybody gets an incentive award. And so I really have concerns about staff making the recommendations to change the benchmark. Specifically in private equity, we lowered it by, it used to be, you had to beat it. There's a combination at plus 300 bips, and then we lowered it, we cut it in half to 150 bips, and now everyone's getting their incentive award. So I really want our new consultant, when they come on board, to really go back and take a look at this, beating the benchmark when staff is setting those benchmark levels. I think there's a little conflict there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Gonzaga, I have a question. It's regarding your section on the caveats regarding the Internal Revenue potential changes, and you talk about it could end up being retroactive. Are you referring to the discussions that are being held regarding the $400,000 threshold, the change in the brackets? Or are you referring to something that currently exists?
Oh, it's just it's our standard disclosure, and really what it comes down to is that these recommendations are based on and how the tax ramifications would work for this are based on existing law, and they're always subject to change. But it's our standard caveat. We sit in the tax practice, and it's just it just speaks to the fact that we're dealing with the known regulations as they now exist.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rubalcaba?
Again,
Here you go.
I'm having problems. There we go. Change. Don't move. Okay, good. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I had a question, Mr. Gonzalez, Ms. Eric. In the recommendation, the second point is a reduction in the current annual incentive range. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming it's a total package, so that makes sense with the introduction of the long term. But my question is, how does it compare with the practice for everybody else in the investment office? Is that consistent? And I support the whole thing about trying to look at it as a total fund and getting everybody in the same program. So, but how does it compare? Is it the same policy that was adopted, or is it consistent with what happens with everybody in the office? Thank you.
It would be, yeah, and that's a great point. It would be the exact same plan that the investment office is being incentivized under.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Yee?
Thank you, President Jones. Just following on to Mr. Rubalcaba's question, Mr. Gonzaga, could you comment also on the external position impact after these changes? We have more of our peers looking at long-term incentive as a significant portion of compensation at the end of the day, and trying to sync up with what's happening with the rest of the investment office. And then with these changes, just kind of what the I guess the ultimate positioning is of the CIO LTIP here.
Yeah, and Missy, you were breaking up a little bit at the initial.
Okay, I can repeat it. I'm sorry. So just following on to Mr. Rubalcaba's question about internal positioning, but also external positioning. To the extent the market data that you have us looking at comping doesn't include the LTIP, kind of what and LTIP's becoming more of the significant portions of compensation with peer organizations. Kind of at the end of the day, where do we find ourselves in terms of relative external position?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And what I'll say is it's at the very low end for comparable sized asset managers in the for-profit industry. However, when you take a look, if you were to include the various pension and other peers sitting out there, the larger pensions, it would position you at about it's going to be below the Canadian pension funds, but it will be competitive with the larger pension funds out there. Now, the issue, of course, is always, and I think CalPERS is always going to struggle with this. I mean, you're not looking to pay somebody what industry will provide. You're looking for somebody who has a mission orientation and is willing to take, essentially a pay cut from what they otherwise could earn in industry. These are still very significant amounts. And so this is consistent with your philosophy. It actually brings your CIO up to 50th percentile competitive total cash positioning in the aggregate. It's not as competitive as what other folks could earn out there in industry. But as you can see, I mean, these are still obviously very meaningful dollars, particularly when we start thinking about, this as a pay level for a public servant.
Okay. I just think important to keep in mind as we're obviously undergoing a recruitment.
That's right.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Middleton?
I think Ms. Yee asked exactly the question that I was going to ask. So let me just state and make sure I understood the answer correctly. The package that's being proposed here will put us at the low end in comparison to for-profit entities, below the Canadian public pension funds, and essentially at level, approximately 50% level to U.S. pension funds. Is that accurate?
Yeah, based on the blended peer group, that's correct.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Olivares?
Thank you. And I'm following up to Ms. Middleton's and Ms. Yee's questions. So where does our LTIP compare to, or how does it compare to CalSTRS and UC Regents?
Well, in I can't, I'm familiar with the CalSTRS, plan, and it does position you, I think, all in from a total compensation standpoint, moderately above, but they don't have a long-term incentive.
They don't have one. No, they just have an incentive plan. So let's back that up a little bit. So how does our annual incentive range compare with that of CalSTRS?
It's moderately lower. To the extent that you were to make the change, it's maybe 20 percentage points lower. But in the aggregate, when you couple on the long-term incentive, puts you at moderately higher than CalSTRS.
So our annual incentive range is 20% lower than that of CalPERS. I mean, are you saying that CalSTRS is 0 to 140%?
I think that they are, if I remember correctly, they may be 0 to 200%.
0 to 200%. Okay.
Yeah. So, Ms. Oliver, so they were in the 1920 fiscal year for the chief investment officer 0 to 150. They've been moving gradually up. They just approved a recent change to go to 0 to 200 with not a target for the 2021 fiscal year, but they do not have a long-term incentive as of yet. I believe that's one of the discussion points they're having with their it's third-party investment comp consultant as well. And then the salary bands for that role are all somewhat moderately less than ours, as I think last time they did a salary review is prior to our revisions in the 2019 or 2018 period. So they're close, but they're higher on the annual and a little lower on the overall base salary.
Lower on the base salary, right? And that's the part that becomes pension income, and higher on the annual incentive, which is going to vary. How is their retention, right? Because part of having this long-term incentive plan is to retain investment talent. So within their investment executive team, how has their retention been?
I don't know if I can answer the question about the retention of the entire investment team. Clearly their CIO has been in the role for quite some time. Yeah. They have a smaller team. Much of it's managed. They manage through third-party consultant work. So it's a different makeup. But I can't speak to that. We could look into that kind of data or work with the boards and comp consultant to help pull that information.
And then UC Regents, do we have insight into that model?
I do not have that data in front of me, but what I'll tell you is that when you take a look at the amounts that we're talking about here, I mean, if you were to take a look at, other university investment funds, the amounts that we're talking about would not be anywhere near the top of the market for, other comparable university funds.
Well, I'm not talking Yale and Harvard. Not that I ever want to put Yale and Harvard in the same bucket.
No. Understood.
So Ms. Oliveris, I think if I can answer that question about the regents, my last understanding was, I believe our salary is basically nearly identical in the terms of the top of the range for that role. And I believe they have a sort of more of a rolling 3-year sort of deferred compensation on the annual, sort of an annual long-term kind of blended. We can confirm that, but I believe that's over a 3-year period of time, which gets paid out in sort of different percentage chunks each year. So by the 3rd year, you're fully paid out, and then it starts again.
Like a vesting period.
In terms of that, yes.
Interesting.
Sort of a deferred vesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting structure. And what about the other California pensions, like some of the county and city structures?
I'm familiar with a couple of them, and the only thing, CalPERS would be higher than the great majority of them. Now, they tend to be different because just having spoken and worked with a couple different ones, I know that they tend to be externally managed as opposed to housing a lot of the investments internally. But the dollars for some of the ones that I've worked with and spoken with historically are lower than what we're talking about here.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Sure. Mr. Miller.
My question was kind of toward the university and other foundations, and I think it was pretty well covered by Ms. Oliveira's question, so I have no further question on that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so no further questions from the board. This is an action item, but before we go there, we do have a request to speak on this item from the public. So, Mr. Fox, are you there?
Yes, Mr. President. We have one caller, J.J. Jelensik, for item 6A.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is J.J. Jelensik, a beneficiary. The risk adjustment is necessary if you're going to create incentives. Otherwise, you create an incentive to take excess risk. Global Governance Advisors, your new consultant, recommends that. Grant Thornton and the board's position has been to begin to pay bonuses for almost reaching the benchmark. And that is not, I think, the appropriate way to handle it. A little history lesson for the audience, since I know the board has done its homework. In December of 2018, there was a discussion, and it was basically a history lesson and an identification of next steps on long-term performance, but no details. On February 19, the consultant presented a proposal, and the board changed the base rate and the incentive ranges. It also selected option C, which had the long-term incentive in it, but had no details, and staff was directed to go back and prepare some details. In September of 2019, the board adopted the concept of a long-term incentive program, but it had no details. November 19, the board adopted a policy which includes the long-term incentive. But however, it was done as a consent item. So there really was no discussion of what it was. And it's really based on compound growth rate. It's not particularly consistent with the description that Grant Thornton just gave. In June of 2020, the board did adopt the consultant's recommendation on the compensation for the chief executive officer, but it has no mention of long-term incentive in it. I will acknowledge the previous article had a letter from the consultant saying that the board had adopted it. I will point out that this proposal does not define what it is. I think the constituents deserve to know what the long-term incentive is. I don't know what the board has discussed in closed session, but since it's a policy issue, I would assume there has been no discussion in closed session, and the members and the beneficiaries deserve to know what is being adopted. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question, Ms. Olivares.
Thank you.
Uh,
I don't know what that was. Okay. I had a question regarding pay equity. So I would like to know what the lowest compensation range is within the investment office and how that would compare to the max potential compensation under Grant Thornton's recommendation.
You know, Doug, do you have that at your disposal? Mr. Hoffner.
Yep. Yeah, I have a document in front of me. I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. So are you looking, Ms. Olivares, for any pay scale range for investment-related positions that are incentive eligible, or are we talking rank and file? I'm just want to make sure I clarify.
Including rank and file. And as a pay equity question, what I'm looking at is kind of this in terms of multiples. And we look at this with some of the publicly traded companies that we invest in. So for the lowest paid worker versus the highest paid worker, which is often the CEO, in this case with CalPERS, it's the CIO. I want to know what that multiple is and what range we're talking about so that we are also considering pay equity, so that we're recruiting and retaining the best talent possible.
So Doug, do you have the pay range? So if I'm understanding her question, pay range for an investment officer 1. And those are not incentive eligible positions.
Correct.
Right.
They are not. They are not incentive eligible.
And not part of the 20098 that is salary set by the board.
Correct. So investment officer 2s would just become incentive eligible through bargaining, and we can get that information. I do not have it at my fingertips, but I think the team's trying to gather that now. I do have it for the associate investment manager positions, which is in that same policy I referenced earlier.
I would want to see IO1, the minimum for IO1.
So why don't we just have that as a follow-up item, Ms. Frost, to provide that information to the board. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is an action item. Do we have a motion?
I'll make the motion.
Moved by
There's a comment and a question.
Beg your pardon? Wait just a minute. Wait, Ms. Oliver. It's been moved by Ms. Taylor and second by Mr. Miller. Question, Ms. Oliveris.
No, I was saying before that there was a comment and a question before you.
Yeah, Arena and Lisa, it looks like.
Okay, so Ms. Ortega?
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And it's the timing is fine. It's a comment on the on the motion. I have the same concern about this proposal that I had as it related to the staff in terms of the long-term incentive simply being added on to the compensation structure on top of the annual incentive. And I think what I would like to see is maybe a further reduction of the annual incentive and the focus on the long-term incentive. I think that would more align with the other stated goal of wanting to have somebody who will hopefully stay for the 5-year period, as was discussed earlier. I think that this just becomes otherwise a very high salary that I think is it's very hard for me to support in terms of our role as a public pension. I think the point that was made earlier about where these numbers put us in terms of our comparators and the comparisons that are made in our market study, I realize that it doesn't put us at the top, and in fact may make us look less desirable, but I still would go back to earlier objections that I know that I've made and others from CalHR have made about who is in fact in the comparison group when we do that salary study. And I think the responses to the questions that Ms. Olivares asked about UC Regents and CalSTRS and some of the other California pension funds, and the fact that that information isn't kind of part of this discussion, it's in my opinion largely because the comparators that are looked at are outside private industry, other types of funds that I'm not convinced are the best candidates for us to compare ourselves to. So for those reasons, I will not be supporting the motion, and I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Middleton?
Thank you, Mr. President. I realize how important it is for us to move forward with a decision today. But the question I would ask, it will be a few months before we complete the process. And while the decision we make today informs us and will inform candidates, is there anything in the decision we're making today that would preclude us from making alterations to what the incentive package is going to be by the time that we conclude a agreement with a potential new CIO?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jones. Yeah, Ms. Middleton, I think it's, as we are out doing our own candidate outreach, or we have candidates reaching out to us, certainly a part of that conversation, and in particular for those who have, the competencies and the talent that we are actively seeking. There are some knowns that they would like to have, and one of the knowns certainly would be around the compensation. If we were So if I'm understanding your question, maybe delaying this and, getting a little more detail together for the board for November. November is probably okay, but I think in order to get candidates seriously interested, one of the knowns, not the unknowns, but one of the knowns would be, what is the comp structure? If I'm, thinking about leaving, my company, I'm thinking about relocating my family to Sacramento, compensation has to be factored into that decision.
Okay. Ms. Yee?
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I guess there are a couple of considerations here. I actually, given the nature of the questions, if we could put this off until November, until we get some of the questions answered that have been posed. And I understand, Ms. Frost, the need to really come to a conclusion about this, certainly for recruitment purposes. So I do want to not hold that up. But the other factor, too, is just I don't want to end up being in a situation of where we kind of have a bifurcated system with respect to the LTIPs within the investment office. And so I think there's a consistency issue and certainly a internal positioning issue that we're going to have to contend with if there are changes to this. So, but I would be open to getting more information back just to see if we could be more informed about any further adjustments to the annual incentive.
Okay, we do have a motion and a second on the floor, but I'm going to go ahead and ask Ms. Olivares. She has a question, and then we have to decide whether you asking the maker of the motion to rescind that motion, or are you willing to make a substitute motion? So Ms. Olivares.
I'm sorry, was that?
Mr. Oliveris?
Did you have something, Ms. Yee?
I was just going to see if the maker of the motion would be willing to rescind the motion and to put this item off until November.
Okay, let's go ahead and hear Ms. Oliveris. We got a couple more requests to speak, and then we'll entertain that decision. Ms. Oliveris. You're muted, Ms. Oliveris.
Sorry about that. On the IO1 position, the investment officer 1 position, there's a bulletin for it online on the job site for California. And the base salary is $44,736. So if we're looking at the difference between the lowest range annual salary in the investment office and comparing it to the highest range, we're talking 53.77x. Or the CIO would make more than 50 times more. And as we look at pay equity when it comes to publicly traded companies, I think we also need to be cognizant of what message that sends to our own team. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ruffino.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. For the reason already stated, I'm not going to, I believe that my principal would support the controller's request to rescind the motion and to get some additional information that's been requested prior to make a final decision. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now we go back to Ms. Yee's request of Mrs. Taylor and Mr. Miller.
So my question to that is, I can just rescind the motion and you can direct staff? Would that be easier than making a substitute motion? Okay, so then I rescind the motion.
Okay.
That's the maker of the motion.
Okay, Mr. Miller, you concur?
I agree. I'm in accord. I concur.
So the direction is to return to the November meeting to continue this discussion, providing the feedback that the board members have requested. Okay, so that concludes this item. We will now move on to information agenda item 7A, Chief Investment Officer recruitment search process and timeline, and solicitation of board members' input on CIO skills and characteristics. Mrs. Frost.
Yeah, thank you, President Jones. So good afternoon. This agenda item is really intended to engage the board as well as to receive public comment on the competencies, the skills, the attributes, behaviors necessary for the CalPERS Chief Investment Officer. We have an active recruitment underway and have hired Korn Ferry, who's with us today, to assist in the search. So before I turn this over to Michael Kennedy, I will walk through a couple more pieces for you. But our goal on this agenda item is to take the feedback and incorporate that into all of the selection processes. So for example, we would create candidate screens, we would create candidate assessments, and Korn Ferry will talk about a candidate assessment tool that they use. We will devise or create the interview questions, as well as doing reference checking on those points. As you know, CalPERS has really experienced quite significant turnover in its chief investment officer relative to its peers, and in particular the public pension space. And so we are really looking for a candidate who can make a minimum commitment of 5 years. And what that will also allow us to do is to better build an internal pipeline of individuals who can compete. Not that we would not have internal candidates who are highly qualified to do it, but we want a very strong, wide candidate pool to select from, which would include internal candidates. So I would, Michael Kennedy will talk about that assessment tool, as I mentioned. And then for the public who are watching and for the board, the process really will be as follows. So once a candidate pool has been determined, interviews will be scheduled. And typically we do 2 rounds of interviews. The board president will determine the board members who will participate during the interview processes. And typically that's 3 board members per interview round. These interview rounds will be publicly noticed. However, we would not be providing the actual candidate name on that notice. And once a candidate is selected, we will bring that candidate or finalist back to the full board, also publicly noticed, no candidate name provided at that time, but to give the full board an opportunity to interact, engage that candidate's fit based on the competencies, skills, behaviors, attributes, et cetera, that have been defined through this session. So with that, hopefully Mr. Kennedy has been promoted to the open session, and we can go into his prepared remarks as well. Again, I think the assessment tool that will be used, there could be some good questions from the board on that as well. So with that, thank you. And we can ask Michael Kennedy to get started.
Michael is in the room and he should be able to share his audio and his video.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Michael Kennedy, and I'm a senior partner at Korn Ferry based in the Atlanta office. Have been at the firm for 21 years and do conduct a lot of searches for public pension plans focused on CEOs as well as chief investment officers. And I'm joined on this call by my colleague, Sydney Baumgartner, who's based in the New York office. So what we want to do today is really a couple of things. We want to engage with the board and start to get feedback from the board as we talk about the attributes and competencies that are going to be used in this search. And also, we want to tell you a little bit more about the Korn Ferry assessment tool, KF4D, which is going to be a vital part of the search process. So just to give you a little bit of color around what KF4D is and what it's meant to do, this is a proprietary assessment tool that Korn Ferry has developed and has used over the last 20 years, and this is the latest iteration of it. And in some respects, it's sort of like a psychometric tool, and what it's designed to do is to really get at cultural fit for an organization. So we look at the competencies and the traits of the candidates and really take a look at how they stack up against what we will call a benchmark for CalPERS. And how that works is the tool, the way it works is that we will be following up with each of you to send out a link over the next week, and we'll ask you to fill the link out. And the link you'll receive will have a list of competencies, and you're going to be asked to rank those competencies. And then we will take all of those competencies and aggregate them into the top 5. And then we'll come back to you with a listing of these are the 5 top competencies that the board at CalPERS has come up with that you want us to focus on as we conduct the search. Now, the last time we conducted the search 2 years ago, the 5 mission critical competencies that we work with were as follows. Ensure accountability, aligns execution, courage, strategic vision, and develops talent. So you may come to a different listing of mission critical competencies when we conduct this exercise this time. Now, what we do with that information is that we put together what we call a CalPERS benchmark. And then later in the search, when we have a short list of candidates, we have that short list of candidates take the KF4D assessment, but it's a different sort of exercise from what you're going to be doing. They'll be taking about a 45-minute case study where they're given decisions along the way, and they're asked to rank their responses. And after they rank their responses, they're given another exercise or question, and then asked to rate their responses and rank them again. And from that, we will get a profile on the individual candidates that we can then overlay against the benchmark of CalPERS to determine how the candidates match up against the so-called cultural fit benchmark of CalPERS. There will be areas where they fall below the line for CalPERS, and they were maybe specific areas there above the line at CalPERS. So, for example, one of their choices could be that their position of power, if you look at the competency power, may fall below the benchmark of CalPERS. So what that may mean is that this candidate is not really driven by power. So even though a person in the benchmark that CalPERS has put together, that particular item may be at a certain level, the person you're looking for, this person is not going to be driven by that, which is actually a good thing. So there'll be more to follow on that, but the reason why we use this assessment tool is to provide you with more data on cultural fit. When we conduct our searches, we find that candidates are hired because of their technical knowledge and experience and track records and things of that nature. And most of the time when it doesn't work out, it's due to lack of cultural fit. Since we designed this tool and have used this tool, we've done probably 7 million executives that we put through the assessment tool to date. And what we have found is that many of our candidates stick for a longer period of time than without using this assessment tool. And we've done some research around all of that. And again, it's just an additional data tool for you to understand culturally how they fit. And then in addition to that, the Korn Ferry team will be interviewing each of the candidates and coming back to you with our appraisal on each one, sharing with you our views on their strengths, their weaknesses, why they're motivated for this role, a bit more information on their previous experiences. We asked the candidates to put together some information on their investment performance. So all of that is going to be part of the process as the candidates are being interviewed and vetted as they go through the system. The KF4D is the last step once you get to the short list of candidates. So I wanted to make sure you're aware of that because you will be getting a link from Korn Ferry again within the next week. It'll take you all of 10 or 15 minutes to fill it out, and then that will give us the competencies. We're more than happy to share those competencies back to the board to make sure that you're comfortable with that. And then that's what we'll be using along the way as we talk to candidates, and it'll show up later in the KF4D. So that's what the KF4D assessment is designed to do. When we get to that point, we actually have a person on our team who's a PhD, and that's all that she does is work with our clients to share their perspective in some detail on the results of the KF4D assessment. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions, and then I do have one other thing I want to chat with the board about.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Yeah, we do have a couple questions. Ms. Taylor?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Kennedy, just a quick question. You were going over the list. Could you do that again for me?
Oh, sure. So the list of the mission critical competencies from last time? Okay, so ensure accountability, align execution, courage, strategic vision, and develops talent.
All right, great. Thank you.
Okay. And just to give you a little bit of color around some of those, some of them are pretty straightforward. So develop talent, you have a large organization, 350 investment professionals, and this individual is going to be very, very involved in that. Strategic vision, someone who can be creative, strategic as they look at investment strategies, things of that nature. Courage, this individual is leading a large, complex, sophisticated investment organization and will need to feel confident and have courage to put ideas on the table. Aligns execution to make sure the team is fully aligned so everyone knows what the strategy is, and then the sure accountability throughout the organization. So that just gives you a little bit of color around, I think, why these were mission critical competencies. But again, you'll have the opportunity to weigh in and develop your own set of competencies for this particular search.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rufino? You're muted. Mr. Rufino, you're muted. Mr. Rufino, you're muted.
He's not talking. I don't know if he can hear us.
Yeah, probably can. Why don't we ask David to follow up with him, and while we're waiting on that, we'll go on to Ms. Oliveris and we'll return. Oh, wait, hold on. Mr. Rufino, can you hear me? Okay, it's still not going.
Yes, there seems to be issues with connectivity. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jones. I have a clarification question, and that might be answered by the HR. It says position specification. Are these the same? Is this the same as the SPB, the State Personnel Board specification? That's my first question. I'm not sure if those are the same, or is this unique to our board?
Thank you, Mr. Rufino. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. And I think I heard your question, Mr. Rufino. You're breaking up a bit, but this is a CalPERS classification, so it's Chief Investment Officer, Public Employee.
Cannot hear any. I can't hear any.
Was that your question?
Did you hear her, Mr.
I did not hear the answer. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Mr. Rufino, this is the job.
We're having a connectivity problem.
Okay.
Okay. Why don't we ask David to work on that, and we'll come back to Ms. Tucker. We'll come back to for you to answer his question and see if we could clear that up. Okay.
I think
Mr. Jones, I got a follow-up question real quick. I did not answer. I assume that these are not. So I assume this is not SPB spec, correct? So because I was trying to determine when was the last time that was revised and whether this board has the ability to revise the job specs without the traditional process in the civil service process.
Yes, Mr. Rufino, can you hear us?
Can this board revise or change? Yes, I think.
You're still breaking up, Mr. Rufino. And I don't think the entire question was heard.
So I think we understand the question.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure if it's me.
Answer it and get it into the record, and then I will follow up directly with Mr. Rufino to answer it. But let's get it into the record.
Okay. So you will.
So I think the system is working now. I mean, I think. Sorry, can you guys hear me, or was it just me?
No, I can hear you. I can hear you now. Thank you, Jason. Okay, we're gonna get that in the record. Okay, so while we working on it, Mr. Rufino, we'll come back to you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Okay, Ms. Oliveris.
Thank you, Mr. President. This question is for Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, thank you for that context about Korn Ferry's process. While you were speaking, I went to look it up online on Korn Ferry's site, and I found the Korn Ferry 4-dimensional executive assessment. Very thorough document, about 200 pages, a little bit more than that. Could we have that sent to us so that we understand the assessment process as well?
Sure. We can send that to you as well as a sample profile, so you can see what the document will look like at the end. So therefore, you'll be able to see what a benchmark will look like for CalPERS. It won't be CalPERS in that document, but we can get that to you.
Thank you. The more information, the better.
Okay.
I don't know if you want 200 pages though, but we can get you quite a bit.
Yeah.
I already have it open and have been reading it. It's just a statistical analysis.
Okay, sure. We can get that to you.
Mr. Hoffner, Ms. Frost has stepped out, so you got that as a to-do follow-up direction, okay?
Correct, we got that. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Perez. Mr. Perez? Okay. We come back, Mr. Perez. Okay, we go on to Ms. Middleton.
Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay.
Mr. Kennedy, could you describe your impression of what the CalPERS CIO job is like in terms of being attractive to candidates in comparison to other assignments that are out there in the public pension world, and what it is about CalPERS that would be exciting to some of the best and strongest individuals in this field?
Sure, that's a very good question. My first response would be that CalPERS has an international reputation, so it has a global reputation, and I think that's going to differentiate it from just about every other U.S. public pension plan. And that's why I think a lot of candidates here in the U.S. are going to be excited to raise their hand to participate in the process, because they view this as an opportunity to lead the largest pension plan in the U.S., but also be viewed as a global investor and have relationships with pension plans all over the world. So the scale is going to be one thing. The reputation of the organization is going to be another. I think the other dynamic is the internal management. I think candidates will be attracted to having a staff where they can do some pretty innovative and interesting things with an internal staff and not have to outsource everything to external managers. So that's going to be a plus. But I think those would be sort of the major reasons why people are going to be very interested in CalPERS, that differentiates CalPERS from other CIO opportunities in the marketplace.
So it's fair to say we're not simply looking for someone to lead our investment office. We're looking for someone who will be a leader within this industry.
Yes, because of the position and reputation of scale of CalPERS, this person will be viewed as a leader in representing the public pension arena. So, for example, if CalPERS is doing something interesting as pertains to private equity or infrastructure or something like that, it's going to gain notice within the industry. So other U.S. pension plans are going to be interested in learning what CalPERS is doing. So from that aspect, there is a leadership component to it. And this individual will be the one who you may see on CNBC and other media outlets more so than other public pension plan chief investment officers around the country, which is why, again, we need for this person to have very strong communication skills.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Frost, have you gotten Mr. Ruffino's question?
Yes, I did answer what we had already placed into the record.
Okay, so there's no further questions from Mr. Ruffino at this time. Okay, all right. Okay, then Mr. Perez, I guess you're still not on. So we'll go on to Ms. Yee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I really appreciate the focus on the competencies, Mr. Kennedy, and I think particularly setting an expectation that through the position spec as well, that there's an emphasis on these more public-facing duties, which I think is something that I think we all understand that the candidates may not coming in just to understand the extent of that. So I very much appreciate that being front and center, as well as the work with the stakeholders. So I think that I really applaud you for that. My question has to do with, and I'm sorry, I keep getting stuck on this position specification, and I think it has to do with my mindset kind of being on state position statements, but on the professional experience and qualifications, I'm still not reading it as the qualification being one that requires a college degree. Usually when we say equivalent to graduation from college, it's kind of a proxy. And so I just wanted to be clear that, I mean, I assume that all these candidates are going to have college degrees, so I'm not necessarily worried about it, but I just don't want there to be any question that comes up educational background. And so I don't know if others share that concern, but it's just my own kind of orientation around the word equivalent, which in state service means something different.
Mr. Kennedy, you want to respond to that?
Sure. So, yeah, Michelle, you want to respond to that?
Ms. Tucker first, and then Mr. Kennedy.
Right.
I apologize, Mr. Kennedy. So there is a classification specification, which is an SPB document, and that lays out the education patterns. And so there are 3 patterns. 2 are internal, and then there's a 3rd external pattern, which does require education equivalent to graduation from college with a major work in business administration, economics, finance, or closely related fields. And so the position description that's in your agenda packet is the more specific position description that we can change if we wish for this particular recruitment for this particular vacancy versus the spec, which is a more permanent legal document.
Okay. I mean, I guess, Ms. Tucker, am I making sense in terms of what I'm trying to drive at? Because I guess I'm just worried that it's not clear, even though we talk about graduation from college with certain work. It's just that word equivalent, which I think, generally speaking, in state service kind of suggests that it's something other than, but equal to.
So, Ms. Yee, are you suggesting that you would feel more comfortable if we had wording in the position description that required a college degree?
Yes, I don't know that we need to be ambiguous about it. And I think just in terms of optics, so we're not having to deal with it down the road, that might be a good idea up front. If it's possible to change that, okay, that would be terrific. And then secondly, given this environment in which we find ourselves, I guess both to Mr. Kennedy and to Mr. Jones, the interview process. I guess the concern about how do we accurately measure fit if most of what we're going to have to do may have to be virtual, or are we contemplating in-person interviews and meetings?
That's an excellent question.
Yes. Yeah, I think let me address that, Ms. Yee. So we do believe that we need some in-person contact with any real candidate for the CalPERS CIO. And CalPERS has some pretty large conference rooms that we can mic up and keep appropriately socially distanced, have a small interview panel toward the end of the rounds where we know we've got the top 1 or 2 candidates. But the idea is we would have an in-person with anyone that we would extend a job offer to.
Good. All right. And Mr. Kennedy, you're on?
Yes, and let me weigh in on that, because what we're seeing in all of our searches today for public plans is that we're able to interview candidates pretty effectively on Zoom for the first round and maybe the second round, but you get to a point where we would recommend, and it's a given, that you have to have the candidate there in person. We would not recommend you hiring someone for this role without people having the opportunity to be there in person to interview them. But in the early stages of the search, I think we're all comfortable utilizing Zoom. That gives us enough insight into the candidates to learn about their experiences and things of that nature to narrow it down. But once you narrow it down, it's important that you see the person face to face.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, Ms. Oliveris?
Ms. Yee?
Can I interrupt real quick, Mr.
Oh, yeah,
Chair?
go ahead, Doug.
I think, Michelle, we need to clarify the question about the college degree. There are 3 patterns for this position. It is a civil service job. And so I think let Michelle just clarify that the 3 different outcomes you can get based upon that specification that was approved by the State Personnel Board for this type of position. Michelle, can you provide that feedback?
Yes, absolutely. So there are 3 patterns. The 3rd pattern, which is the external pattern, has an education requirement that we discussed. And so the first 2 patterns are internal patterns, which is typical for civil service classification. So there's a way where if you've served, for example, as a senior investment officer, as other types of positions in CalPERS, where you would already have had a degree required from that path, you can take the position, or there is some language for equivalency. However, I don't think unless we're using pattern 3, we can absolutely require it. But what we can do is work with Mr. Kennedy and add it as a strongly, highly desirable qualification. That's something that we can, screen for and look for through the process. But I think we can't absolutely require it from people who meet pattern 1 or 2.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify that before we moved on.
I appreciate.
To this point.
Okay, good.
Okay, I appreciate the explanation, and I guess I would ask you to work with Mr. Kennedy on that option about trying to just bolster that.
Okay.
At that end. Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, Mr. Perez, did you have any additional question or comment? You okay?
No, I'm good.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Ms. Oliveras.
Thank you. My question's about the experience. So as I read through the professional experience qualifications, in the first bullet, it says that 1 year of the required experience may be substituted for a graduate degree. And then the next bullet has as a minimum 7 years of increasingly responsible experience. So hypothetically, a candidate could have 6 years of experience of increasingly responsible investment experience and a graduate degree. If we're talking about 6 years, 7 years, honestly, anything fewer than 10 years, I would think that this position would require substantial investment experience, given the size of the portfolio, given the global exposure, the communications that will be required. I want to know how we came to the number of years experience in this document.
Okay. I've got my thoughts on that, but Michelle, did you have any thoughts around that? And I'll give you my thoughts on why it's 7.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I can answer that briefly, and then I think turn it to you for the context. Yeah. So it is a class specification that has the minimum qualification. So this would be the minimum that a person would need to have to be appointed to this position. That does not mean that that would be what we would necessarily go for. We can always look for something higher for greater qualifications, but that is the minimum amount that we could accept. And often I would expect that we would see that combined with other relevant characteristics, other backgrounds, other things that would be compelling. And I think that's where Mr. Kennedy is going to kind of add in. So I can turn it back to you, Mr. Kennedy.
Sure. So Ms. Oliveras, to answer your question, the kind of candidates we're going to be looking for are going to have a lot more than 7 years experience in investment management. There will be some candidates, though, who may have gotten their start in investment banking and worked for Wall Street firms for the first 10 years of their careers, and then decided that they really wanted to move into investment management, and then shifted over into investment management, where they now may be chief investment officers at a significant public plan. So they may have 20 or 25 years of financial services experience, but not all of that is going to be in investment management. But even with that, we would expect them to have more than 7 years in investment management and a leadership role.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I don't get that from what the second bullet reads, because it says, or trading of a varied and complex investment portfolio. So you can trade and you can manage investments, and that seems like it's within the 7 years. So I'd like us to clarify that bullet. And I don't think 7+ years is adequate. I think we're looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years. And there's a big difference between trading a portfolio and managing a very large and a very large investment team and a global portfolio.
Right. And I would say that Korn Ferry would typically be looking for people a little more senior with different types of experiences. But I think we're having to work with the staff at CalPERS because they have certain minimum requirements that have been added to the document. So what you're seeing may be blended. So I think some of the things that you're pointing out I would probably not have typically included in my document. So I'm trying to thread the needle to a certain extent. So that's why the 7 years, for example, I don't think that would be something that I would have placed in my document. I'll be looking for someone with a lot more experience than that. When you look at the candidates who we have today that we're pursuing, all of these are very seasoned investment professionals who've been in the industry for a number of years in leadership roles, and they've got pretty extensive track records and are pretty well known in the industry. So they have a lot more than just 7 years.
Thank you. That's reassuring. I want to make it clear to the investment community that we are seeking the best candidates that are extremely seasoned.
Yes.
And this
Yes.
does not reflect that. So I would like a document that reflects that, because I also want us, I want us to put our best foot forward too in recruiting candidates. And I think showing a requirement for more experience in investment and investment management, in addition in some other areas, it would be quite helpful.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. Okay, Ms. Brown.
Thank you, President Jones. So my questions follow almost exactly along the lines of Ms. Yee and Ms. Olivares, which is first about the degree. And so now I understand, Ms. Schell, according to you, pattern 3 are for people coming from outside the state, and that would require a mandatory degree. Is that correct? And if not, can we change that for pattern 3?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, Ms. Brown, that would require a degree.
Okay, great. So
That's
we're
correct.
going to that. And then in terms of the experience, I also would agree that I would like to see a minimum of 10 years experience. And so, Michelle, is there a problem with changing it to say that?
We can certainly work with Mr. Kennedy to add that language to the bulletin. We can't change the spec language quite so readily, but we can certainly add that additional preference to the job description. That's no problem, and we'll work with Mr. Kennedy after today's meeting to get that updated.
Great. And then I also think the criteria of leadership experience, I mean, even if you manage a pension fund, you still, we are looking for that sort of leadership skill, that someone that's already been out front for many years. I know, Mr. Kennedy, you're saying that the people you're looking at or trying to recruit will meet that goal. And I just want to make sure that, we don't get someone who hasn't been sort of in that top spot previously, because that hasn't worked out for us so far to date. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think Ms. Oliver, I mean, not Oliver, but Ms. Tager, you are okay? Okay, and Ms. Taylor, you are okay, or are you back in?
I'm back in. I just want to reiterate, I think under professional experience qualifications, I think we're trying to hew closely to the SPB thing, as Ms. Tucker said. So if we can do the qualification for professional experience qualifications, I don't know where you would put that, because if we're trying to hew to the SPB document, if you put that elsewhere, the 10 to 15 years, I would assume you'd have to put that elsewhere because it wouldn't match, is my only concern.
Yeah, Ms. Taylor, we'll put it into the recruitment brochure, and we'll use it as an initial screen for candidates coming in, is how we'll do it.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Mr. Ruffino. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. So I just looked up the SPB specs on the position, and I just want to point out that it was established in 2004, and there has been no revisions since 2004. So that's a long time. So I certainly don't think we need to stall, or we need, but I think at some point it will be wise to reevaluate and take a look, because the minimum qualification as well as the specs itself, as it is right now, only 3 years of experience is required. Years as a senior investment officer or 5 years as a senior portfolio manager. So, or 7 years in planning and directing. So it certainly it needs some revisions. Should try to get these revisions.
Thank you, Mr. Ruffino. We'll put, with the board, we'll go ahead and put that down as board direction to bring that back perhaps next year. But for this recruitment, I think that we can manage it through the recruitment brochure itself on these additional screens on qualifications that we'd want to see the candidates have in order to get an interview.
Okay, Mr. Ruffino? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Rubalcaba.
I think you also missed Lisa.
Yeah. Mr. Rubalcaba, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Jones. I'm still having problems with the mood. I just had a quick comment. One is, I do want to get a clarification. So there's a recruitment brochure that's, I guess, gives a more outward focus of what we're looking for. So if you could get some clarification on that vis-a-vis the position classification, position specification. And
Right.
but speaking to position classification, I thought it was very well written. I liked, at least what I liked is how it conveys the whole public face. That's, you know, very CalPERS, because that's what the CIO will face, and also the need for relationships and the roles between the board and the CEO. I thought was very good. And I just think I want to comment, but I guess it's obvious, is that no matter what the minimum requirements are, there'll be a screening, and you know, that's done by Korn Ferry, and that will, I'm sure, once we get a final pool, it would meet the board's expectations. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, Ms. Middleton.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. And I appreciate the discussion around what's the minimum number of years that of experience that someone should have. I'm not necessarily opposed to increasing those number of years, but I'd remind my colleagues, when we set a minimum, that's simply a minimum that allows someone to compete for the job. And I don't think Mr. Kennedy and his firm is going to bring us anyone who is not an extremely qualified talent. And I would be nervous about us creating too many minimum and potentially missing out on the extraordinary talent, the extraordinary younger talent that might be the perfect fit for CalPERS.
Yes, and I can assure you that we're going to be bringing very senior and seasoned professionals to CalPERS. So even though there may be minimums in the California specific spec or guidelines that are much less than that, that's not going to be the caliber of candidate we're going to be bringing to CalPERS. So I think I can assure the board of that just based on the people that we're talking to so far.
Okay. Well, thank you, board members. And we do have a request to speak on this item from the public. Mr. Fox.
Yes, Mr. President, we have one caller, Dr. Robert Gerling, CSU retiree faculty.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to talk on this very important topic. I've reviewed the document that's available, and I have a major concern, and that is given the recent history of CalPERS leadership with regard to the position of the CIO, I think it's imperative that you include in the characteristics that you screen for a demonstrated track record of ethical leadership and practice. And what I'm referring to specifically is you want to make sure that whoever makes it to the final cut is someone who has a demonstrated track record of obeying the law, of being honest, and with documentation of demonstrated integrity, respect for coworkers, any avoidance of conflict of interest must be ruled out, and a commitment to the principles of equity. In addition to which, I think leading a team of professionals is something that is what is required of this position. And each and every one of the people who works at CalPERS is a highly trained and qualified staff member. So it is very important that whoever is selected for that position or whoever even makes it to the interview level must have at least a master's degree in order to be able to be on the same footing as the staff that they will be leading. And I would hope that you will actually document and verify any degrees that the candidates might have. That is a very important thing. I'd like to close by saying that since CalPERS is a public agency in the state of California, we are a state which prides ourselves on our ethical leadership on a national and global level. So, and finally, this is a highly desirable position, as you've mentioned. And so the candidate will earn, in addition to a financial remuneration, substantial non-pecuniary remuneration. And I think that it's important that we not hire someone who is mainly interested in a high salary. And if that's the case, then this may not be the right person. And I question the earlier presentation about which focused on the very, a maximal level of remuneration. I'd ask the board to kind of reconsider that as you have. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And just a comment, I think, Mr. Kennedy, the ethical standards will be part of the process in terms of your tool and your process of interviewing and background checks. So that will be addressed, I'm sure. So.
Yeah,
okay.
let me just weigh in for 1 minute, Henry, on that, because we recognize that these are public pension plans. And as such, you can't afford to hire someone who doesn't have high ethics and high integrity. So that's something we're going to be very, very attuned to. And Mr. Fox, I believe, if that's your name, you mentioned verifying education, things of that nature. We verify the candidates' educational credentials before we bring them into CalPERS for an interview. You would be surprised at the number of executives who are in their 50s even in the country today, who for whatever reason, their education was never verified, and they're pretty senior in their careers. And now the CFA or the MBA from Columbia that is on the resume is not really accurate. So we try to catch that before we even bring them into CalPERS for an interview. So we're going to be very attuned to ethics and integrity and those things.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, that moves us to the next item on the agenda, is summary of board direction. Ms. Frost.
Mr. Jones, this is Matt Jacobs. Ms. Frost had to leave to catch a flight, so I'm going to stand in for this part.
Okay.
And what I have is bring back an agenda item to remind the board of the current incentive structures. Bring back the long-term incentive item to the November meeting. and address questions regarding what peer, in connection with that item, address questions regarding what peers are doing relative to base pay, incentives, and long-term pay structures. That is what I have. Did I miss something?
Doug, I think there was one other thing that I think Doug was going, I don't think I heard that one.
Yeah, so the one other item, Mr. Jacobs, was the KF4D, the document that Mr. Kennedy talked about. I think there's a kind of a description document which is quite voluminous that we would be sharing out as a link or as an attachment.
Okay, good. Okay, Ms. Brown?
I just wanted to remind about the KF4D, but Doug beat me to it. Thank you.
Right. Okay, I think that's all then. That's fine, Mr. Jacobs. And so now we will move to the last item, public comment. Beg pardon? Public comment. Mr. Fox, I think I got a note that there's a request to speak under public comment.
Mr. President, we had a caller that has since terminated the call, so we are finished with public comment.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. So then that brings us to the conclusion of this board meeting, and thank all the board members for convening with a very short notice to deal with this very important task that we have before us. And so we look forward to our next discussion surrounding our recruitment for our new CIO. So with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much. Oh,